names this morning, and your names and my name is not on there, so that means we stay here for life. And what a good way to entertain life, but to be here and to be educated. The Industrial Revolution in art, but seeing history through art. A unique venture that we've been very, very happy to have for 2 sessions, and now for our last. Timothy, it's all yours.
Thank you. Announcements. Ohio State University, 34. Notre Dame, 23. Yes! Now, I don't have a Buckeye sweatshirt, but Iowa is a member of the Big Ten Conference. So this will have to do. Besides, it's an eye, you know, it's not a Buckeye, but it's a Hawkeye. I went to graduate school at University of Iowa. Okay. You may be wondering why we stopped in the 1940s. Why not go on? One of the reasons we don't go on is because the art world during the 1950s was overtaken by a new movement. It was called abstract expressionism. And it involved what are sometimes called drip paintings, where artists like Jackson Pollock would roll out the canvas on their studio floor, and they used house paint. And they would have buckets of house paint, and they dip the brush in, and they, but with an artistic flair, okay? Which explains the first picture. The gentleman is standing in front of a drip-style, Jackson Pollock-style painting. And actually, it's pretty good. But of course, the artist is Norman Rockwell. And if Norman Rockwell was asked to do a abstract expressionist drip painting, he could do it. What interests me the most about the gentleman standing with his back to us in front of the canvas is, what is the expression on his face? Anyhow, so we're going to start off with Norman Rockwell. Even though this was painted, by the way, in 1962, when abstract expressionism was sort of at its height in the United States. But yes, Dr. McQueen.
Except for the lack of braces on his legs, the first thing I said, what is Franklin Delano Roosevelt doing looking at that? Look at that.
That's okay, he doesn't need the mic.
I don't know one of the things that maybe you could see Franklin Delano Roosevelt looking at that picture.
Well, it was the time period closed.
Got me. Wish I could answer that, but. Okay, well, let's go back to our period. Let's go back to the period that I want to discuss today. And our period is the 1930s. And of course, the 1930s was distinguished by the Great Depression. That wasn't the only disaster that was going on during the 1930s. The 1930s was also the decade of the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl was a disaster that affected the Midwest, all the way from the lower Midwestern plains of Texas and Oklahoma north into Canada. Okay? So it was a twin disaster. And both disasters, the Depression, of course, was an industrial stock market economic disaster, were at least in part man-made. The Dust Bowl was caused by what would you call it? Cultivation of lands that should not have been farmed in that way. They were mostly small farms, and so it was difficult to establish, practices like contour plowing on small farms. But they would farm year after year after year, the same small farm on relatively weak soils, using straight back and forth plowing, and then came a drought followed by windstorms, and it created these huge dust storms where the silt blown off of the lower plains would be carried all the way up into lower Canada. Okay? So this particular picture is Dallas, South Dakota. It was taken outside of the little town of Dallas in South Dakota, 1936. And it was a photograph taken by a FSA photographer, that stands for Farm Security Administration. We don't know his name, but it speaks volumes. Look at the automobile that's virtually buried in dust, or the wagon wheels that are covered all the way up above the hub in dust, the abandoned farmhouse in the background. That caused, among other things, a major migration of people, mostly from the southern plains and prairies, west to the west coast. Oklahoma, Texas, Missouri, Kansas. People got out because they could no longer farm their land. And they ended up in places like California and Washington and Oregon. They were called Okies. That was the term that was normally applied to them. But most of them were not from Oklahoma, though a great many of them were. The FSA was one of the New Deal programs. In addition to providing loans to farmers so they could keep farming, they also sent out a whole slew of photographers. And they put their photographs in newspapers and magazines so they could make people in other parts of the country aware of the terrible disaster that had taken place in the Midwest, and get some sympathy, get some support. Next slide. This is probably, I would guess, the most famous photograph of the 20th century. This is Dorothea Lange, who was also an FSA photographer. It was also taken in 1936, and it is called simply Migrant Mother. It is a picture of Florence Owens Thompson, who was a 32-year-old mother of 3 children, and it was taken in a migrant camp in California, outside of a huge commercial pea farm, and she has her 3 children with her. Lange did not consider herself an artist, but I'm sorry, when I look at this picture, I mean, I think it just screams art, the composition of it, and the feeling that it portrays. It reminds me of some of the great Renaissance mother and child paintings. And you know, most of the Renaissance, the big name Renaissance artists, did dozens of them. Some of them did hundreds, because they sold them to people as devotionals. People would have them up in their homes and pray in front of them. And here are 2 of them. Okay? The first one is by Andrea Mantegna, and he was a 15th century Italian painter. And it is called Madonna and Sleeping Child, 1465 to 1470. The dates are kind of inexact, because this was early in the Renaissance when they weren't keeping more accurate records as they did later. Okay? And the second one is Madonna and Child by Giovanni Bellini. Both of them, I think, are just gorgeous paintings. And besides, you knew you weren't going to get out of here without seeing at least a couple of Renaissance paintings. Okay. The next painting. This is a mural. In the 1930s, largely due to the New Deal and programs like the Works Progress Administration, was the age of murals in the United States. This particular muralist, and by the way, this picture is in the Detroit Institute of Arts, and it is a huge mural. This is just a section of it that goes all the way around a very large lobby, and the lobby is on, 3 tiers, and it is called, appropriately enough, Detroit Industry. And it is by Diego Rivera. Diego Rivera was a Mexican muralist and painter, and he had come to the United States in the 1930s both to teach the art of painting murals and to paint murals. And he was hired by the Detroit Institute of Arts, which, by the way, as you could probably guess if you know about these great art museums throughout the United States, was a product of the Ford family. Okay? The Fords paid for it, in spite of the fact that Rivera was an avowed communist. And he was very active during the Mexican Revolution of the 1920s, where he switched over to the Communist Party. So why did we have to have a Mexican artist come up to teach people how to do murals? Because murals are tricky. They use a technique, in addition to being able to paint, large figures and blow them up proportionately so that people understand what they're looking at. They were usually painted in a technique called fresco. Okay? Fresco was basically painting on wet plaster and using water-soluble paint, so that when you painted on the wet plaster, the paint was absorbed by the plaster and it actually became part of the wall. And so murals painted in fresco tend to last a long time. For example, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome is painted on fresco. That same technique. And fresco goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. They painted in fresco. Sumerians painted in fresco. So it's an ancient technique, but it is a technique that in the United States was pretty much lost by the 1930s. So Rivera came to teach people not only how to paint on large surfaces like this, but how to use the fresco technique. Look at the picture itself. Look at the balance in the composition, right? Machines are relatively the same shape on both sides. Workers pulling engine blocks at the lower part, but balanced in terms of the numbers. And at the top, this is something unusual. That's a steel mill. The Ford Motor Company was the only automobile manufacturer in the United States that had its own steel mill. It was in River Rouge. The River Rouge plant had a steel mill. And you can see the molten steel coming down these various conveyors. You can see one worker up there testing the steel. Notice that the colors are bright and they're transparent, which is something you could do much easier with water-soluble paints than you can with oil paint. Oil paint tends to give a much more solid surface, but fresco painters liked these bright colors simply because they made the painting, the composition, more visible from a distance. The emphasis here is on the workers. The Depression had the effect of raising the status of workers. Up until this time, industrial workers and miners and many other manual workers had very low status and very low pay. This was also the age when the big labor unions came into existence, like the United Auto Workers, okay, the steel workers. How about the next one? Well, okay, now the Fords are not going to be outdone by the Rockefellers. So in 1933, the Rockefeller family commissioned Diego Rivera, this is another Rivera fresco, to do murals in the new Rockefeller Center in New York City. And Rivera had a contract, okay? And you know what contracts involve. So he paints, this is one section of a much larger mural. And it's very complex, very complicated. It's beautiful and it's balanced, but it's, I don't know, I think it's kind of overly busy. But what really made this fresco famous was this guy right here. Okay? None other than Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. And when the Rockefellers spotted that, they said, that will not fly, Diego. You got to paint it out and put in a portrait of every man. Well, did I mention that Rivera had a contract? He said he would not paint over Lenin's portrait. Remember, he's an avowed communist. And the Rockefellers said, well, then we will destroy it. We'll take it down. And Diego said, hey, I got my money. Take it down if that's what you want to do. He was an ornery guy, obviously. Okay. But it is called, by the way, the title of it, 1933, the year after the Detroit mural, it's called Man, Controller of the Universe. Who knew? Right? I mean, I have a feeling that particular title was up for, let's say there were differing opinions.
Question, did they destroy it?
Pardon? Yes, they did.
Oh.
They destroyed it. These pictures were taken, a whole series of pictures were taken before it was destroyed by one of the people who was assistant to Rivera.
That hand holding it looks like an ancestor of
I like that. Yeah, I never thought of that, Jim. Thank you. Oh, by the way, if you have questions, we've got a microphone, and Jake would be happy to, hand you the mic. So you just stick your hand up in the air. Okay. Thank you, Jake. Anyway, this is also a mural. This is a mural from Chicago. It's in a high school in Chicago, and it was painted in 1933. 1933 was a big year for murals, and it was painted by Rudolf Weissenborn. And it is painted in the Cubist style. Okay? So notice that everything in it is sharply angled and geometric, and yet, like most European Cubist paintings, you can pretty much figure out what's going on in it. It's not totally abstract. Okay? The emphasis here, or the theme here, is productive activity. So in the center, because he was an artist, Weissenborn has got an artist. He's got a sculptor sculpting a statue. And then around the mural are various other activities. Up here in the left-hand corner is a rodeo performer. Okay? Why a rodeo performer? I mean, it represents the active arts. Well, Weissenborn lived for a number of years in Colorado, and one of the things he did while he was in Colorado is he performed in rodeos, okay? So he's got a rodeo cowboy. Beneath that, you see a series of gears and wheels and belts for representing industrial production. Over on this side, you see beams and rivets for construction. And above that, you see the columns of what we would assume would be a public building, government, okay, like a courthouse. Next one. Yet another mural. Now, you've seen work by this guy before. Last week, I showed you a couple of pictures by Thomas Hart Benton. Thomas Hart Benton was one of those American realist or regional realist painters, And he was hired by the state of Indiana to paint this very, very large mural. Again, this is just a section of the mural for the Chicago World's Fair in 1933. And it is called The History of Indiana. Now, this mural, and particularly this section of it, was very controversial. Why do you think? Pardon? No?
Well, that's part of it.
That's part of it, yeah, that's part of it. It sort of tells a whole story, but the story begins up here. Yeah. It shows a Klan rally where they're burning a cross, and there's a speaker, rousting out the people. The Klan, by the way, had the largest membership, state membership in the United States, which might surprise you. But during the 1920s, the Klan had more members than any other state in the Union. So much so that they were able to take over the legislature, and they were also able to elect a governor. And they committed a lot of illegal activities because they were empowered to do these kinds of things. Jim?
I was going to simply say that their downfall came when their elected governor more or less abducted one of his secretaries and carried her across a state line.
Yeah, which was,
So the feds got it.
yeah, he violated the Mann Act, which made that illegal. But that wasn't the only illegal thing they did. And that probably would not have come out except for other sectors of this mural. For example, these guys down here who represent the press, okay? You can see a printing press. You can see a newspaper reporter. You can see an editor checking over the copy. It was the press that revealed the Klan's crimes and brought to light things like the governor's violation of the Mann Act and brought them down. He also included medical workers who did not discriminate against people of a different race or a different nationality. He also included circus performers, and the Klan was against circus performers, largely because they thought that the circus that we all know and love, Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey, was European. It wasn't American. They didn't realize that many of the forms of entertainment that Americans enjoyed, like the minstrel show, were based on the circus. And also, there were a lot of European circus companies that were traveling around the United States, small companies, okay? So he's got that in there. Over here, there is the spire, the tall spire of a church. And there was a town in the state of Indiana, Peru, Indiana, which was very heavily Catholic. And so Benton thought he would stick that in there because the Klan was against Catholics, okay? I can't think of too many people that they weren't against, but anyway. And then he's got firefighters over here fighting a blaze. And firefighters, like the medical professionals, did not discriminate. If you were an African-American person and your house was burning down, the fire department was right there to put it out, just like they were if you were, a rich white person. So people in Indiana didn't like it because even today, there are a lot of people in America who don't like things about our history, okay? And so they want to do things like tear down Confederate monuments because it reminds them of unpleasant things in the past. So this is nothing new. Benton, of course, was not moved. Benton was like Diego Rivera. He was ornery, and he had his mind set, and if he didn't like his mural, he'd tear it down. The state of Indiana loved the mural. They sent it up to Chicago for the World's Fair, and now it sits in a building on the campus of the University of Indiana in Bloomington. Okay. Well, this is the lobby of the Toledo, Ohio public library that was built in 1940 as a WPA project. Again, WPA stands for the Works Progress Administration. It was another of the New Deal programs. It was focused on new buildings, constructing new buildings, giving construction workers work. So why this? Well, I think the picture itself indicates that it's a pretty stunning building. The interior of the building is almost completely lined in a type of glass known as vitrolite. Okay? And vitrolite was a structural glass that was developed by the Libby Owens Ford Company. I think there are some of you who have probably heard of the Libby Owens Ford Company, since they opened a plant down here in Laurinburg. But look at the columns, the walls. The floor, by the way, is not glass. The floor is terrazzo, but it's highly polished. And it is in the style known as Art Deco. And Rivera's murals were also in the Art Deco style. The Art Deco style emphasized geometric forms, okay? Straight lines or geometrically curved lines. And it also emphasized patterns, so you repeated the forms. And this interior is a great example of what Art Deco looked like. You can see the windows, for example, in the second tier here. There are 3 in a pattern. They are surrounded by glass bricks. The skylight is also in the same pattern, 3 lights, okay? These were panels in the wall. They weren't windows themselves above it. So it's Art Deco. Some of you have probably seen and maybe even admired the Chrysler Building in New York City. The Chrysler Building is probably the biggest, flashiest example of Art Deco in the United States. But here you see it in a library lobby. This library cost $4 million to build. Pardon? $2 million. Okay, but what's the value today?
About 45, but that may just be the WPA part. That may just be for the workers rather than for the whole thing.
Well, that all goes into the bill. So yeah, an example of inflation. Okay. Anyway,
You did all the paintings on the walls.
those are not paintings as such. They are murals. They are glass. The colored parts of the mural, can we see the next slide? Oops. There you go. This is one of the murals, and this is the mural that in the picture that preceded it, you're looking directly at, but now you got a close-up. The colored parts are art glass, okay? And over 80 different colors of art glass were used in making these murals, and they are attached to a vitrolite background. And this one is called American Pride, and it celebrates production, industrial production, scientific production, science itself. In the center, you see the scales of justice. And right beneath it, you see a telegraph key. Over on this side, you see drums full of presumably petroleum. Symbol up here for electricity. All across, you see airplanes and railroad trains. This gentleman walking out here may be an architect. Right? He's got the plans of a building underneath his arm, and he's carrying a briefcase. Next to him is a secretary. Okay? Buildings down here, the product of building. A pen representing writing. Okay? Probably newspaper writing. Over here, you've got a worker, and he's rolling out a hand cart full of goods. This is something that probably most of us are fairly familiar with. Anybody know what that is? It's a ticker tape machine. They haven't been in use for quite a few years. But when this thing was built, they were definitely part of the whole industrial setup. File cases, okay? Ships here. Yeah. It seems to say, I mean, this is 1940, folks. We're not at war yet, but World War II is already underway. It started in 1939. And I think by this time, most Americans, and certainly most people in the American government, realized we were going to be involved in this thing. And I don't know, this seems to send a message. If we're going to come, this is what we're bringing with us. And if you dare to take us on, well, God help you. Toledo was sometimes known as Little Detroit. There are a number of cities in the Great Lakes region that were kind of modeled on the production of Detroit. By the way, Detroit and southeastern Michigan, which includes Toledo, which is northwestern Ohio, produced over 1/3 of the war materiel during World War II. Just this one area. But Toledo had automobile plants, it had steel mills, it also had the glass industry, okay? And so the library itself was sort of an advertisement both for Toledo and for the glass industry. Okay.
You done? You want to go ahead to?
Yeah.
Okay. That-
Well, okay. The Depression was tough. Lots of people suffered during the Depression. Lots of people struggled during the Depression. The government did what it thought it needed to do to try to bring us out of the Depression. Anybody know what ended the Depression?
World War II.
Absolutely. World War II ended the Depression. And one of the things that brought victory in World War II were places like Detroit and Toledo and Cleveland and Chicago, the industrial Midwest. Toledo is, of course, I call it the rivet on the Rust Belt, because this type of industrial production has fallen behind things like Silicon Valley and technology. But these kinds of economic developments, which have created billionaires, a good many of them, really haven't had much effect on working men, which the New Deal and World War II helped bring up and helped support. Anyway, y'all know what this is. This is a still, of course, from The Wizard of Oz.
Looks like they're dreaming of Disney World.
Disney World wished it could look like the Emerald City. Okay? The Emerald City off in the distance, and there's the Cowardly Lion and the Scarecrow and Toto and Dorothy and the Tin Man finally getting to their goal, following the yellow brick road till they get to the Emerald City. And the Emerald City is this dream city, this imaginary end of their troubles. And as you know, having seen the film, I'm assuming everybody in here has seen it at least once. I used to teach a film course, and this was always one of the films that I showed. And I probably have seen this film 25 times, maybe more. And I'll watch it again, too. Anyway, here they come after their adventures with the flying monkeys and the Wicked Witch and all of the nasty things that she was trying to inflict upon them during their travels to the Emerald City. There they are. They're reaching their goal. Well, they haven't met the wizard yet, but you know, they think they're reaching their goal. So I think this fits in too with the whole story of the Depression. Okay. Next. Going back to the Toledo Public Library. This is another mural. This is a art glass on vitrolite, and it represents one of the nursery rhymes that most kids knew when they were young. The three little kittens who lost their mittens. You can't see it, but over here they have another representation, Sing a Song of Sixpence, but we're only going to discuss this one. So, I always thought when I heard this when I was a kid that the mother cat was not a very nice lady. She was kind of mean. Okay, so would anybody care to join me in reciting? The three little kittens, they lost their mittens, and they began to cry. Oh, mother dear, we sadly fear that we have lost our mittens. Then you shall have, what? Lost your mittens, you naughty kittens? Then you shall have no pie. Meow, meow, meow. Then you shall have no pie. Yes. Jim? Oh, yeah, there are several verses, but we're not going to. Yeah. Oh, they get their pie, but then the silly little kittens, they eat their pie with their mittens on, so their mittens get all sticky and dirty, and mom gets mad again, and it goes on and on. By the way, I think I must have looked at this mural 3 or 4 times before I realized what happened to those mittens when they got lost. Look at that mean bird up there. He stole their mittens and used them to line his or her nest. Anyway, thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed it and had as much fun as I did. And I know that many of you will be going off to lunch in your various dining halls. So please, on us, have some pie.
Questions? Any at all?
Yeah, I've got one. Tim, I didn't notice this till this morning, and your list says that the mother and child is Botticelli, and you said Bellini, and I think it is Bellini. I think it's wrong on here. Do you know which it is?
The first one, the one on the left side, was Andrea Mantegna.
Yeah, that's not, yeah.
And that's called Mother and Sleeping Child.
That's the other one.
And the other one was by Giovanni Botticelli.
It was Botticelli, huh? Okay.
Yes,
Because it's, okay.
yeah.
All
There,
right.
there were a bunch of Botticellis, but he was the first one.
Really, I thought that there was only one.
Sandro Botticelli,
Oh.
Venus on Half Shell.
I'm amazed that you can educate that lady who knows everything. Next month, the 18th, we will gather. It's going to be unique. We're going to really kind of come home for the presentation. A PhD named Marcus,
That's okay.
Jeff Marcus, who works for the Nature Conservancy. And his job over the last 10 years has been to restore the Lumbee River and the Lumbee tribal grounds. Now that becomes critical because as the Lumbee tribe work for recognition, tribal recognition depends at least in part upon what you've done with your grounds and your possessions. As you know, Tom Tillis, in this present iteration of the Congress, will attempt to have the Tribal Recognition Act made completely fulfilled for the Lumbee. So, Marcus will bring us history. He has worked with the Lumbees for 10 years, and the lovely thing for me is it's our backyard. So, enjoy the moment, stay warm, and go in peace.
Also, you have to come because I am a Lumbee, Jake Dow.